There is gallium inside the device in your pocket right now. Not a trace amount. A functional layer engineered into compound semiconductors that make the radio hardware work. The power conversion run efficiently. The signal reach the tower. That gallium, almost certainly, passed through a Chinese license desk before it reached the factory that built your device. That desk has been operating since August 2023. It approves exports one shipment at a time, case by case, with no standing whitelist, no automatic clearance for trusted buyers, no grandfather clause for existing supply relationships. Every gram that left China after that date got an individual sign-off, or it didn't ship. Once you know that, the device in your hand looks slightly different. You might say, gallium has been processed for decades. Surely someone built an alternative supply chain somewhere. The answer is almost no one did. And the reason why is more interesting than the oversight it appears to be. The economic logic that made China the world's dominant gallium refiner was not a strategy. It was a side effect. Understanding that side effect is the only way to understand why the license desk has the power it has. Compound semiconductors are not exotic materials for niche applications. Gallium arsenide and gallium nitride are the layer underneath 5G base stations, electric vehicle inverters, satellite transponders, and defense radar systems. If the desk slows or stops approving shipments, those supply chains do not reroute in weeks. They reroute in years, if they can reroute at all. By the end of this, you will understand what gallium actually does inside a chip, why refining it became so concentrated in one country, what the case-by-case licensing regime actually means for a company trying to plan a production run 6 months out, and what it would actually take to build a real alternative. This is not really a story about a metal. It is a story about where leverage actually lives in a supply chain. Not at the finished product, not at the chip fabrication plant, but one layer deeper, at the refinery and the export desk sitting behind it. So let's trace it. Start with what gallium actually does and why the obvious substitute does not work. Silicon is the material that runs the world's digital infrastructure. Logic chips, memory, most processors. It is abundant, well understood, and cheap to work with at scale. But there are applications where silicon simply cannot perform. High-frequency radio transmission, high-voltage power switching at speed, the kind of signal amplification a 5G base station power amplifier needs to push a signal across distance. In these domains, the physics of silicon are the wrong physics. Gallium nitride handles voltages and switching speeds that silicon cannot match in certain radio frequency bands. Gallium arsenide provides electron mobility that makes it the material of choice for satellite and radar applications, where silicon would introduce too much signal loss. These are not performance preferences that better manufacturing could eventually close. They are intrinsic properties of the materials. The electrons in gallium nitride simply move differently than the electrons in silicon. You cannot fab a 5G power amplifier in silicon and get the same result. You get a worse product or no viable product. Think of it this way. Silicon is the general-purpose road surface. It handles most traffic. It is everywhere. It works. Gallium nitride is the runway material. You cannot land a jet on asphalt, not because no one has tried to engineer around it, but because the physics do not support it at those speeds and loads. The engineers working on 5G base stations, electric vehicle charging hardware, and radar systems are not using gallium because it is fashionable. They are using it because the alternatives do not work. Companies like Coherent, a major United States-listed compound semiconductor manufacturer, build products that depend on this material. The compound semiconductor market is not a corner of the industry. It is the enabling layer under some of the most important infrastructure categories of the next decade. So the material is non-negotiable, which means the supply line is non-negotiable. And that supply line has a shape most people have never looked at carefully. Gallium is not mined directly. There is no gallium mine. The metal is a byproduct of processing bauxite, the ore that becomes aluminum, through an industrial process called the Bayer process. When you refine bauxite into aluminum oxide on the way to making aluminum metal, gallium accumulates in the processing residue. If you have the scale to run large aluminum smelting operations and you invest in the separation and purification step, you extract gallium as a secondary product. If you do not run that smelting operation, you do not get gallium. China runs the largest aluminum smelting operation in the world by a wide margin. That industrial fact and the cheap energy that supports it made China the natural home for gallium refining, not by strategic design, but by industrial logic. The feedstock volume was there, the energy cost was low, the downstream demand existed. Roughly 80% of the world's refined gallium, by widely cited analyst and industry estimates, comes out of Chinese refineries. The exact figure varies somewhat by source and year, but the dominant share is not disputed. Now, here is the part that matters. Outside China, those conditions did not combine to make independent gallium refining economically attractive, not while Chinese supply was available, reliable, and cheap. Building a competing refinery requires running the upstream aluminum smelting that produces the gallium-bearing residue, investing in the separation step, and convincing downstream chip companies to commit to buying from you at a higher price than they were paying for Chinese supply. The downstream customers had no reason to make that commitment as long as the Chinese supply was flowing. The potential refinery builders had no reason to invest without that downstream commitment. The chicken and egg problem is real, and it persisted for long enough that non-Chinese refining capacity never developed to scale. Imagine you need a rare spice that only appears as a byproduct of one specific type of cooking. If one kitchen is doing the large majority of that cooking, the spice just accumulates there. Building your own kitchen to get the spice means running the entire cooking operation yourself. You cannot just open a spice shop. The economics of that are unattractive as long as the kitchen that already has the spice will sell it to you. Some policy efforts to break this pattern are now underway in the United States, the European Union, and Japan. But building refining capacity takes years. It requires guaranteed purchase commitments from downstream buyers who have been comfortable with existing supply. The policy intention is real. The capacity is not yet real at scale. So by 2023, the world had the dependency baked in. Then Beijing picked up the pen. On August 1st, 2023, China's Ministry of Commerce implemented an export licensing requirement for gallium and germanium. The word licensing understates what changed. Before August 2023, gallium moved through commercial channels like a commodity. After August 2023, each individual export shipment required its own approval from Chinese authorities, case by case, no standing whitelist, no pre-cleared category for allied nations or long-term commercial partners. This distinction matters enormously for the companies trying to plan around it. A blanket ban, while severe, is at least predictable. You know you have zero incoming supply and you plan accordingly. A case-by-case approval desk is something different. You might get approval. You might not. You might get it 3 weeks late. You cannot commit to a customer delivery schedule 6 months out if the input material for that production run needs an individual sign-off from a foreign government with no stated processing timeline and no disclosed approval criteria. The uncertainty is itself a form of leverage, entirely independent of whether the desk has ever said no to a major buyer. Think about what that means for a company like Coherent, which manufactures compound semiconductor products and operates production planning cycles that extend months into the future. The question is not only whether gallium arrives. The question is whether the production team can commit to a delivery date for a customer when the key input requires clearing a desk whose decisions are opaque and whose timeline is undefined. That operational reality changes procurement strategy, inventory decisions, and customer conversations, whether or not the desk has ever actually denied a significant shipment. As of the knowledge boundary of this script, the public record does not confirm large-scale gallium export denials or independently verified supply shortages caused by the licensing regime. But that absence of confirmed denials is not the same as evidence the regime has no effect. The approval data is not public. The processing timelines are not disclosed. The regime's opacity is itself part of its power. The desk exists. Its leverage does not require it to have already slammed shut. It only requires the buyer to know it could. Which brings the obvious question: can the rest of the world build its way out of this? The answer is real but slow. Gallium is not geologically scarce. It is diffuse in the Earth's crust, present in many places, not locked in a few rare deposits. The constraint is not that the planet is running out. The constraint is that refining infrastructure and feedstock concentration sit overwhelmingly inside one country, and replacing that concentration requires rebuilding the industrial stack from the aluminum smelting level upward. A stockpile is not a solution to that. A stockpile is a water tower. It keeps the taps running when the main line is interrupted. But if the main supply stays offline, the tower empties. You need the pipeline, not just the tower. Some governments and companies hold gallium stockpiles. Those reserves are finite. Their volumes are not publicly confirmed in full, and their adequacy for an extended supply disruption is not established. They are a bridge, and bridges have the other side as a destination. Secondary recovery, reclaiming gallium from manufacturing scrap and end-of-life devices, exists, but gallium volumes in individual devices are small, and recovery rates at the industry level are low. Secondary recovery supplements primary refining. It does not replace it at current demand scales. Industrial precedent for building new refining capacity in critical materials suggests the timeline is measured in years, not months. Policy responses are underway. Confirmed capacity is not yet there. So the supply chain has a real, functioning choke point and no short-term exit. That changes what we should be asking. Before August 2023, China's dominance of gallium refining was a market condition. It was the outcome of industrial economics, not a political instrument. Companies priced it. Procurement teams worked around its concentration risks, and analysts noted it in critical minerals reports that mostly sat in government archives. After August 2023, it became something else. The same physical fact, that roughly 80% of refined gallium comes from Chinese refineries, was converted into an administrative reality. Every compound semiconductor company that sources gallium now operates in a world where a Chinese government desk has an actual formal say in their production schedule. Not theoretically, actually. The gallium in devices shipped by manufacturers, including Coherent, moved through that desk. The next gram has to move through it again. The compound semiconductor applications at stake here are not marginal. 5G infrastructure, defense radar systems, electric vehicle power electronics, satellite communications. These are the categories that governments and industries have identified as strategically central to the next decade. The supply chain serving all of them runs through a single administrative choke point that no allied nation has an equivalent to replace. Here is my honest read. The triumphalist version of this story, that China has already broken Western compound semiconductor supply, that shortages are imminent and confirmed, is not supported by what the public record actually shows. Exports have continued under the licensing regime. Major production disruptions attributable to gallium denials have not been independently confirmed. That version overstates what the evidence proves. But the dismissive version, that this is bureaucratic noise, a paper regulation with no real teeth, a formality that changes nothing, ignores what it actually means to plan a manufacturing operation when every gallium shipment needs an individual foreign government approval with no defined timeline and no disclosed criteria. Supply chain planners at compound semiconductor companies, procurement teams, and government policy offices are all moving differently because of that desk. Inventory strategies have changed. Sourcing diversification efforts that were theoretical before 2023 are now being funded. That behavioral change is real, and it is already happening, even if the shelves are not yet empty. The reading I keep returning to is this: the desk does not need to say no to exercise leverage. It only needs to exist. And it does. The license desk does not sit at the border of a finished product. It sits at the origin of the material the entire compound semiconductor supply chain runs on. The gallium in your device cleared it once. Every gram that follows has to clear it again, one shipment at a time, on terms set in Beijing. Here is what I genuinely want to know from you. Which matters more right now? The fact that the desk exists and is already shaping how companies and governments plan, or the fact that it has not demonstrably stopped major shipments yet? Those two answers lead to very different conclusions about urgency and policy response. One says the leverage is theoretical until it gets used. The other says the leverage is already being used, just quietly, through uncertainty rather than denial. I do not think either side is obviously wrong. Tell me where you land in the comments. Subscribe if you want to track how this actually develops, whether the approvals tighten, whether real non-Chinese refining capacity gets built at scale, and what the companies inside this supply chain say and do next. That is exactly what this channel follows. The device in your hand got through. The desk is still open. That is the whole story, and also the beginning of the next one.